Welcome to a Sherlock Holmes mystery. A seemingly innocent Christmas gift, a deadly secret, and London shrouded in fog. But before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? Share your thoughts below. It was upon a bleak December morning, a week before Christmas of the year 1893, when I was roused from sleep by a sharp tapping upon my window. The fog lay heavy over Baker Street, and the faint glow of gas lamps made pale halos in the mist. I rose, half expecting to find a messenger from Scotland Yard, for such visits were not unusual during the holiday season, when desperation and crime walked hand in hand through the streets of London. Instead, I found a well-dressed young man, his face white as frost, clutching a small parcel in one gloved hand. He introduced himself in a trembling voice as Mr. Alfred Hatherley, a clerk in the employ of Sir Reginald Fortescue, the shipping magnate. His manner was that of a man who had seen something too dreadful to believe. I invited him in and offered the comfort of our fire, which crackled warmly in the hearth of our sitting room at 221B Baker Street. Holmes, who had been reading the Times with a languid air, looked up at once. He had not dressed yet, but wore his dressing gown, pipe in hand, and that curious gleam in his eyes which only appeared when some riddle presented itself. "Pray sit down, Mr. Hatherley," said he in his calm yet commanding tone. "You have been frightened within the last hour. There is soot upon your sleeve, evidence of haste, and that small parcel in your hand has not left your grasp since you discovered whatever horror brings you here." The young man's astonishment was nearly comical. "You are correct, sir. It is this parcel that, God help me, it killed my employer not 2 hours ago." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "Indeed?" he murmured, leaning forward. "Then I suggest, Watson, that we delay breakfast. Kindly tell us everything from the beginning, Mr. Hatherley. But first place that parcel upon the table. Do not touch it further." The man obeyed, setting the brown paper package upon the table between us. It was no larger than a hat box, neatly wrapped, tied with red ribbon, and bearing the label, "To Sir Reginald Fortescue, a Christmas gift from an old friend." Mr. Hatherley's story tumbled out in broken sentences. That morning, at precisely 9 o'clock, the parcel had arrived by private messenger at Sir Reginald's residence in Belgravia Square. The servants believed it to be from a foreign business partner, for Sir Reginald's dealings extended as far as the East Indies. He had opened it in the breakfast room in the presence of his butler and secretary Hatherley himself. No sooner had the string been untied than there came a hiss, a puff of pale vapor, and the old man fell back in his chair, gasping and clutching his throat. By the time the household physician arrived, Sir Reginald was dead. Contents, a small silver ornament shaped like a dove, lay harmlessly beside the plate, but the room still reeked faintly of almonds. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Almonds, you say? That is of great interest." He rose suddenly and circled the table, hands clasped behind his back. "And you brought the parcel here instead of to Scotland Yard?" "Yes, sir," said Hatherley. "The constable on duty advised me to deliver it to you directly. He said, 'Pardon me, sir, that if there were devilry in it, you would find the devil out.'" Holmes smiled faintly. "Constable Barker, I presume. A man of sense." He stooped, examined the package, then sniffed the air. Cyanide, faint but distinct. "The killer knew chemistry, Watson. We are dealing with a deliberate murder, planned to the smallest detail." He straightened, his tone suddenly brisk. "Watson, fetch my coat. The fog will not deter us this morning. Mr. Hatherley, we go at once to Belgravia Square. It seems the spirit of Christmas has brought with it a gift most unholy." And so it was that within the hour, Holmes and I were rattling through the fog-choked streets of London in a hansom cab, our breath forming ghosts in the air. Neither of us spoke much during that journey. Holmes stared out of the window, his brow furrowed, while I could not shake the image of that innocent-looking parcel upon our table, its ribbon bright as blood against the brown paper. When we reached the grand house of Sir Reginald Fortescue, a small crowd had gathered despite the fog. Policemen kept them back as we were ushered inside. The Christmas wreath still hung upon the door, but within the drawing room lay a scene of tragedy. The body of Sir Reginald, his features peaceful but his skin faintly discolored, sat still, upright in his chair, as if awaiting the second course of breakfast that would never come. Holmes bent low, studying the silver dove under the dim light. Then, turning toward me, with a gleam of quiet, "Triumph," he whispered. "Watson, note the engraving beneath the wing. Peace on Earth, 1883. Curious, is it not, that a message of peace should conceal so deadly a design?" Holmes remained bent over the silver ornament, his keen eyes darting from the engraving to the faint residue along its inner curve. He handled it delicately, using a pair of tweezers from his pocket case, and held it to the light filtering weakly through the fog-stained window. The faintest trace of white dust clung to the tiny hinge at the dove's wing. Holmes gave a single nod, as though confirming an unspoken theory. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The hinge has been tampered with. It conceals a tiny mechanism, a reservoir, perhaps, or a spring chamber. The release of gas could have occurred the moment Sir Reginald disturbed the wrapping. Ingenious. Coldly ingenious." Inspector Lestrade entered at that moment, stamping his boots against the chill. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, I might have known you'd be here before I'd even had my tea," he grumbled. "A queer business, this. The doctor says poison, but the how of it's beyond us. Nothing swallowed, nothing injected, just dropped dead, as though the Almighty himself had pinched his breath away." "Not the Almighty, Lestrade," said Holmes softly, "but a man who understood that the most efficient weapon is one that travels unseen." Lestrade frowned. "You mean gas?" "Precisely. A vaporized form of prussic acid, I suspect, released by a simple clockwork device hidden in the hinge. A most diabolical invention. The real question is, who would go to such lengths to end Sir Reginald Fortescue's life?" The inspector gave a dry laugh. "Who wouldn't? More like. The man made enemies enough in his time. He was as generous with his business dealings as a crocodile with its prey. There's talk he ruined a dozen merchants, left them destitute while he built his empire." "Indeed," said Holmes, his voice calm. "Then we must separate the merely resentful from the truly vengeful. Tell me, Lestrade, who last saw the victim alive besides Mr. Hatherley and the butler?" "His niece, Miss Clara Fortescue," Lestrade replied. "She came down a few minutes before the package arrived. Poor girl's upstairs now, in quite a state." Holmes glanced toward the staircase. "Watson, let us speak with her presently. But first, Lestrade, may I trouble you to fetch me a candle and a sheet of paper? There's something beneath the table that may prove illuminating." When the items were brought, Holmes crouched, shielding the candle's flame with his hand. He held the paper close to the carpet where the parcel had first lain. Gradually, faint markings appeared, a dusting of pale grey motes that glittered under the light. He touched one with his finger and sniffed it carefully. "Interesting," he murmured. "Traces of volcanic ash, no ordinary London dust, I assure you. It suggests that this wrapping or the package itself may have originated abroad. Perhaps the East Indies or Java. Sir Reginald's commercial ventures may have reached further than his conscience." Holmes rose, folding the paper and slipping it into his pocket. His expression was thoughtful, distant. "Lestrade, I would ask that this room remain untouched for the present. Have your men seal it. Watson, we shall now have a word with Miss Fortescue." Upstairs, we found the young lady pale and trembling by the window, her eyes red from weeping. She was a slender woman of perhaps 24, dressed in mourning black despite the season. At the sight of Holmes, she seemed to cling to the hope that reason might triumph over grief. "Mr. Holmes," she said faintly, "they tell me my uncle was murdered. How can that be? He had no illness, he was cheerful, even jovial this morning. The gift arrived with no warning." "Did your uncle speak of expecting any parcel?" asked Holmes. "No, none. But he was restless of late. A week ago, he burned several letters in the fireplace, saying they were the ravings of a lunatic. I asked him who had written them, but he only laughed and said, "A ghost from the past, my dear. One I thought buried at sea." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Buried at sea, you say? Fascinating." He turned slightly toward me, as though speaking more to himself. "A seafaring connection, a foreign substance, and an assassin who kills from afar. Yes, Watson, the pattern begins to emerge." Miss Fortescue clasped her hands. "Do you think the letters had something to do with it?" "I think they were everything," Holmes replied. "You may depend upon it that the hand which wrote them also dispatched the gift. The question is whose hand?" He offered her a reassuring bow, then turned sharply for the door. "Come, Watson, back to Baker Street. We must examine that parcel under controlled conditions. There are answers hidden within the folds of its paper, answers written in ash and poison." As we descended the stairs, Lestrade called after us. "You've found your clue then, have you, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes paused at the threshold, his silhouette framed against the fog. "Not a clue, Lestrade," he said quietly. "A trail, and if I am not mistaken, it leads us to a man long thought dead." The cold air outside struck us sharply as we emerged from Fortescue's house, our cab waiting in silence beside the curb. Holmes entered first, drawing his coat tightly about him, his mind clearly racing faster than the horses that bore us toward Baker Street. I could sense that he was already formulating a chain of reasoning, piecing together each detail with that uncanny logic that so often left Scotland Yard bewildered and me in speechless admiration. Inside the cab, the rhythmic clatter of hooves provided a grim counterpoint to our thoughts. Holmes remained silent for several minutes, his gaze fixed upon the fog-veiled city. Then, without turning, he said quietly, "Watson, there is something profoundly deliberate in this affair. Every element, the wrapping, the mechanism, the inscription, has been calculated not merely to kill, but to deliver a message. It is murder wearing the mask of sentiment." "A message?" I repeated. "You think the gift was symbolic?" "Undoubtedly. The dove represents peace, does it not? Yet beneath its wing lies death. A contradiction worthy of a poetic mind, a mind both intelligent and embittered." He tapped his fingers against the window frame, then added, "You recall the niece's words. A ghost from the past, one buried at sea. That is no idle metaphor. It is the key to everything." We reached Baker Street as the church bells struck noon. Mrs. Hudson met us at the door, her expression filled with alarm when she saw Holmes carrying the parcel in a sealed glass container. "For heaven's sake, Mr. Holmes, is that dangerous?" she exclaimed. "Only to those who lack caution," Holmes replied, smiling faintly. "Fear not, Mrs. Hudson. I intend to dissect the devil without letting him breathe again." Within minutes, the sitting room had been transformed into a laboratory. Holmes donned his goggles and gloves, laying out instruments with meticulous precision. I stood by, notebook ready, as he carefully unwrapped the parcel's remnants under a glass dome to prevent the escape of any remaining gas. The silver dove, gleaming innocently under the lamplight, seemed almost to mock us. Holmes worked swiftly, removing a minute panel at the bird's breast. Inside, a thin coil of copper wire and a residue of crystalline powder became visible. He collected a trace upon a slip of glass, held it near the flame, and inhaled ever so slightly. "As I suspected," he said, "hydrocyanic acid derived from potassium cyanide. The release was triggered by the tension of this spring. Ingenious, Watson. Quite diabolical." He then turned his BO's attention to the paper wrapping. "Note the fibers, handmade, of Javanese manufacture, and the twine bears traces of sea salt and tar. Our killer is a man of the sea, or one who has spent considerable time upon it." I was about to speak when a sharp knock came at the door. Lestrade entered, looking both winded and grim. "Bad business, Holmes," he said. Another parcel's turned up, same wrapping, same handwriting, addressed to a certain Mr. Rupert Vale, a business rival of Fortescue's. Only this time, the man wasn't at home. His butler opened it. "And the result?" Holmes asked, though the answer was written plainly on Lestrade's face. Dead before the doctor could arrive. The same smell of almonds. The same cursed dove. Holmes's eyes flashed. Then the killer moves quickly. The first death was not enough. He intends a series. Fortescue was but the beginning. He paced the room in measured steps, then halted before the window. "Tell me, Lestrade, does the name Captain Ezra Penrith mean anything to you?" Lestrade frowned. Penrith? Vanished 10 years ago when his ship, the Artemis, went down in the Java Sea. Rumor said Fortescue cheated him of his fortune before he sailed. Holmes turned slowly, the light from the fire catching the sharp lines of his face. "Then, my dear Lestrade, I fear our ghost from the past has returned to London, flesh, blood, and vengeance intact." He drew on his pipe, the smoke curling upward like a spectral whisper. "Mark my words, Watson. Before this Christmas season is over, the murderer will strike again. And unless we act swiftly, the next gift may be delivered straight into the hands of Scotland Yard itself." Holmes's pipe glowed faintly in the dim light of the sitting room, each puff of smoke rising like ghostly tendrils above his sharp, thoughtful profile. Lestrade had gone, leaving behind an air of unease that clung to the chamber like a second fog. I sat across from Holmes, watching him as he stared into the fire with that peculiar stillness of his, a stillness that concealed rapid deduction beneath the calm of absolute concentration. "2 deaths in the same day, Watson," he said at last, his voice low and deliberate. "Both men connected through commerce, both recipients of identical parcels, and both struck down by the same ingenious mechanism. We are not dealing with a crime of passion. This is a campaign of vendetta designed with almost military precision." I nodded gravely. "Then Captain Penrith, if indeed he lives, must be the architect of it all." Holmes turned his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You see, my dear fellow, how neatly the pieces fit. A man wronged by his business partners, lost at sea, yet perhaps not lost after all. 10 years would allow ample time to plan such a revenge. But we must not build our theory on sentiment alone. The sea breeds rumor as readily as it breeds storms." Rose abruptly and crossed to the map of the world pinned upon our wall. His long finger traced a line across the Indian Ocean. "The Artemis was last sighted near Sumatra before vanishing in a typhoon. The currents here," he murmured, "would have carried wreckage westward toward the coast of Java. And Fortescue's trading operations were centered in Batavia at the time. Yes, our murderer was forged in tropical heat and salt air," I ventured. "But how could a man presumed dead return without notice? Surely the records—" "Ah, Watson," Holmes interrupted gently, "death is a convenient cloak for those who wish to disappear. A false name, a forged passage. A few years in some forgotten port, and London's memory is mercifully short. No, our man has returned, and he carries with him the ghosts of a sunken ship." A knock interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram, her face pale with curiosity. Holmes took it, tore it open, and scanned the contents quickly. His eyes brightened. "Excellent." Lestrade moves more swiftly than I credited him. "What news?" I asked. "Scotland Yard has located the handwriting expert I requested. The note attached to the second parcel matches several signatures belonging to an E. Penrith found in the old maritime records. But more curious still, the ink used is of a rare kind, manufactured only in Singapore. That, Watson, narrows our field considerably." He strode to the table, seized his magnifying glass, and studied the wrapping paper anew. "See these faint depressions here barely visible? They form a pattern of vertical lines, impressions left by bamboo mats used in Eastern packing. Whoever prepared these parcels did so abroad or with materials brought from there. I believe we shall find our assassin in the dockside quarters of London, among the sailors who trade with the East." Holmes threw on his overcoat. We go now to the Limehouse wharves. There, amidst the opium dens and warehouses, we may find the man who brought death in a Christmas ribbon. The streets grew darker as we neared the river, the fog thicker, the air foul with tar and smoke. Gaslights flickered weakly above the narrow lanes, revealing shadowy figures who vanished at our approach. The murmur of the Thames echoed faintly through the mist, broken by the distant clang of ship bells. Holmes stopped before a warehouse bearing the sign, Lee and Company, importers of Oriental goods. "Observe," he whispered, "a fitting place for a man returning from the East to conceal himself or to send packages abroad." We entered quietly, guided by a watchman who recognized Holmes from earlier exploits. Inside, the air was heavy with spices, rope, and damp wood. Holmes examined the crates stacked along the walls, pausing at one marked with a faded stencil. "Java, Fortescue, and Co." He smiled thinly. "Our threads converge, Watson. The very firm once owned by our victim. And this crate recently pried. Open." He shone his lantern within. Empty save for the imprint of something small and rectangular, the exact size of the parcel that killed Sir Reginald Fortescue. Just then, a floorboard creaked above us. Holmes raised a hand for silence. From the shadowed loft, a man's voice muttered in a foreign accent. Holmes moved like a cat, ascending the steps soundlessly. I followed, my revolver ready. At the top stood a figure in a tattered sea-coat, his face gaunt, his beard streaked with white. In his trembling hand he held a small wooden box and, unmistakably, a silver dove, identical to the others. Holmes stepped forward, his voice cold and steady. "Captain Ezra Penrith, I presume. You've been a long time at sea, but your reckoning has finally reached the shore." The man's eyes widened with recognition and terror. The box slipped from his grasp, striking the floor with a dull metallic click. Holmes leapt, kicking it aside just as a hiss escaped from within. We both ducked, as a pale vapor coiled into the air, vanishing through the rafters. When the silence returned, Penrith lay trembling at our feet, the madness of years written upon his face. Holmes looked down at him gravely and said, "You see, Watson, some gifts demand to be returned to their sender." For a moment, no one moved. The pale vapor still drifted faintly through the air, curling like smoke from a ghostly censer. Then Holmes, with characteristic composure, knelt beside the trembling man and examined him by the flickering lantern light. Captain Ezra Penrith, if indeed this gaunt spectre was, he had the aspect of one who had stared too long into the abyss. His skin was drawn tight over his bones, his hair bleached white at the temples, and his eyes, clear, fierce, unbroken, held a kind of fevered satisfaction even through the terror that consumed him. Holmes spoke gently, though his voice carried the firmness of command. "Be still, Captain. You have breathed some of the residue, but not enough to harm you gravely. Watson will see to you." I crouched beside the fallen man and noted the faint blue tinge about his lips. A damp handkerchief and the open window soon eased his breathing. When his eyes regained focus, he looked not at me, but at Holmes, as if beholding an apparition from another life. "So," he rasped, his accent still touched with the cadence of the sea. "They told me no man could outwit the great Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I had thought otherwise. Yet here you stand." Holmes's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "And here you kneel, Captain Penrith. It seems neither of us has yet fulfilled the legends told of us." The man gave a broken laugh, then shuddered. "You've come too late, Holmes. The third gift is already on its way. There will be no peace until all three have met their reckoning." "The third?" I exclaimed. "You mean there is another intended victim?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Who, Captain? Speak plainly, for every hour's delay may cost an innocent life." Penrith's voice fell to a hoarse whisper. "Not innocent. Never innocent. You know they're kind men who profit from ruin. Vale, Fortescue, and—" he hesitated, a bitter smile curving his mouth. And the man who betrayed us all, the one who stole my ship's cargo, left my crew to drown, and sent me to rot in the East. His name you will know, Mr. Holmes. You are his friend." The word struck the air like a pistol shot. Holmes's face went utterly still. "My friend," he repeated, very quietly. "Dr. John Watson," said Penrith, his eyes gleaming with feverish satisfaction. The manifest bore his name. The last consignment of the Artemis was marked for Dr. J. Watson, care of Fortescue and Co. It was medical equipment, they said, but it was opium, smuggled for profit. You shared in their gold, whether you knew it or not. I felt the blood drain from my face. "That's a lie," I cried. "I never." Holmes raised a hand to silence me. His gaze did not waver from Penrith's face. "You are mistaken, Captain," he said evenly. "Dr. Watson is as incapable of deceit as you are of mercy, but your delusion has been most instructive." The captain's defiance wavered, but before he could speak again, heavy footsteps echoed from below. Lestrade burst into the room with 2 constables at his back. "Holmes!" We traced the messenger who carried the parcels. "He's in custody, a sailor from Singapore named Roker. Claims he worked under Penrith aboard the Artemis. When we showed him your sketch, he confessed." Holmes nodded grimly. "Then the chain is complete." He turned to the captain. "You see, Penrith, your vengeance has served only to expose yourself. The ghosts of your past would have slept quietly had you allowed them. Now, instead of the gallows, you shall have something more dreadful, the memory of what you became." Penrith gave a long, shuddering sigh and looked toward the open window. Outside, the fog had thinned, and the faint chime of midnight bells drifted across the river. "You call it vengeance," he murmured. "I called it justice. Perhaps there's no difference left between the two." Then, closing his eyes, he added almost peacefully, "Tell Fortescue I've forgiven him. The sea already has." Holmes's voice was soft but unyielding. "Fortescue is dead, Captain. The sea has reclaimed only you." When the constables led the broken man away, Holmes stood long at the window, his face unreadable. I approached him quietly. "You knew from the beginning," I said. "You saw through him before we left Baker Street." Holmes smiled faintly, the smoke from his pipe drifting like the last thread of fog. "From the moment I read the inscription, my dear Watson. Peace on Earth, 1883. The date marked the sinking of the Artemis. But peace, as ever, must be earned. In this case, it was written in poison." Turned from the window and clapped me on the shoulder. "Come, Watson. We shall send word to Lestrade that the final parcel must be intercepted. Then perhaps, after so much death disguised as charity, we might both drink a glass of something wholesome, say, Missus Hudson's mulled wine." And as we left the warehouse, the faint glow of dawn crept across the Thames, dissolving the fog that had cloaked the city through its long and haunted night. The next morning broke with a pale, weary light over Baker Street. The remnants of fog clung stubbornly to the chimneys, and the city, still recovering from the night's events, seemed subdued beneath the dull winter sun. Holmes sat at his desk, the newspaper spread before him, though I knew his mind was far from the printed words. I stood by the window, gazing at the crowds that moved through the slush-covered streets, each person hurrying toward Christmas as though to escape the memory of the crimes that had nearly marred it. Lestrade had telegraphed an hour earlier. The final parcel had indeed been intercepted at the Liverpool docks, addressed to Dr. J. Watson, C.O. Baker Street. It had been posted under a false name and contained yet another silver dove, its wing mechanism identical to those before it. Holmes now held it carefully under the glass dome on his work table, as though it were a relic of some dark religion. "It is a strange business, Holmes," I said quietly, "that a man could be driven so far by the ghosts of betrayal that even the innocent became targets of his vengeance." Holmes did not look up. "Strange, yes, but not incomprehensible. Vengeance is the most corrosive of passions, Watson. It eats through logic, through sanity, until only obsession remains. Captain Penrith mistook coincidence for conspiracy. The manifest bearing your name was likely forged, perhaps even used by Fortescue to smuggle his illicit wares. The captain saw your name, remembered the betrayal, and constructed his fantasy around it. In his mind, he had merely set the scales right. I felt a chill despite the fire's warmth. And yet, but for your intervention, I might have received that parcel myself. Holmes smiled faintly. Then you may count it as one more instance where my interference has saved your excellent head from unpleasant consequences. His tone was light, but there was a shadow behind his eyes, a weight that had not lifted even with the case's conclusion. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. You see, Watson, what fascinates me most is not the act itself, but the mind that conceives it. Penrith had brilliance enough to devise a killing instrument no chemist in London would have detected, but he lacked the moral compass to restrain his intellect. The same ingenuity that could have rebuilt his fortune instead consumed it in hatred. In that lies the truest tragedy. Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson entered with the Morning Post, a single envelope, its edges damp from the fog. Holmes took it, examined the seal, and opened it carefully. Inside lay a single sheet, bearing an unfamiliar hand. To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I thank you for ending my suffering. The sea may yet forgive what man cannot. There will be no more gifts. E.P. I stared at it in silence. He has taken his own life, then? Holmes nodded slowly. So, Lestrade's telegram implies. Penrith slipped from custody before dawn. They found his coat by the river's edge. It appears he returned to the only element that would receive him without judgment. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Outside, a church bell tolled, its sound muffled by the snow now beginning to fall. Holmes rose and stood by the window, watching the flakes gather on the sill. There is a curious symmetry in it, Watson. A man thought drowned returns from the sea to exact revenge, and when his purpose is spent, the sea reclaims him once more. The circle closes neatly. I joined him at the Bayer window. Do you think he ever found peace? Holmes's voice was distant. Wise, wise, wise. Peace is rarely found by those who seek it through blood. But perhaps, in the silence beneath the waves, he may have glimpsed the redemption that eluded him on land. He turned then, his expression softening. You must not let his delusion trouble you, Watson. You were merely an unwitting name in his ledger. If anything, his final act was an admission that reason had returned too late. I nodded, though uneasily. The idea that death could masquerade as generosity, the very symbol of Christmas perverted into an instrument of murder, lingered with me like a stain upon the day. Holmes, however, had already dismissed the matter with his usual calm detachment. He replaced the silver dove within a locked cabinet and said, with a spark of his old humor, Now, my dear fellow, I suggest we banish all thoughts of death and chemistry until after the holiday. Mrs. Hudson's goose will cool if we delay, and I confess that even a detective must eat. I could not help but smile. You surprise me, Holmes. I had thought you above such seasonal indulgences. On the contrary, he replied, reaching for his coat. There is no case so cold that a good goose cannot thaw it. And besides, my mind works best when fortified by Mrs. Hudson's cooking. As we descended to the dining room, the light outside grew brighter, the snow falling more thickly upon the city. The horrors of the past days seemed to fade beneath its silent covering. And though Holmes said no more of the case, I caught him once, glancing toward the cabinet where the deadly dove lay locked away, a faint frown crossing his face, as though he still pondered some unsolved riddle known only to him. Thus ended the affair of the Christmas gift that killed a man. And while many a strange case has since passed through the hands of my remarkable friend, few have haunted my memory as much as that one where peace, charity, and death had worn the same deceitful wrapping. That evening, as the snow thickened into a silent white curtain over London, Holmes and I sat before the fire, both unusually reflective. The day's events had left an unspoken heaviness between us, though justice had, in one sense, prevailed. The conclusion of The Christmas Gift That Killed a Man carried no triumph, only melancholy. Holmes was never one to revel in victory, least of all when his adversary's downfall revealed more of human frailty than of villainy. He sat now in his armchair, pipe resting unlit between his fingers, the firelight throwing restless shadows across his sharp features. I had rarely seen him so still. "Do you know, Watson," he said after a long pause, "I have always regarded Christmas with a certain suspicion. It is the one season when mankind seems determined to disguise itself in virtue, while beneath the tinsel and charity, the old vanities persist unaltered." I smiled faintly. "You are cynical, Holmes. Surely this case has not soured you entirely against goodwill." He gave a quiet laugh, though without mirth. "Goodwill, yes, but genuine goodwill is rare. What we witnessed was the corruption of sentiment. Penrith's gifts were tokens of mockery, his vengeance wrapped in the semblance of peace. That, my dear fellow, is what I find most unsettling. When evil cloaks itself in benevolence, it becomes nearly invisible." The fire crackled, punctuating his words. I thought of the silver doves now locked away in his cabinet, of their deceptive gleam. They were beautiful objects, symbols of purity, turned into instruments of death. Holmes's eyes followed my gaze toward them. "Do you intend to destroy them?" I asked. "In due time," he said. "For the moment, they are evidence of the crime, and perhaps of something greater. A reminder that the line between justice and vengeance is perilously thin. Tell me, Watson, what do you make of Penrith's final note?" I considered my answer carefully. It seemed sincere, a confession written by a man who finally understood his own ruin. But whether remorse redeems him, I cannot say. "Just so." Holmes rose, pacing the carpet slowly. "You see, Watson, Penrith's tragedy was not that he was evil, but that he was righteous in his own mind. Each man he killed he saw as a villain, each parcel as retribution. He fancied himself Providence, balancing the scales. I have met murderers who kill for money, for love, for silence, but rarely one who kills for justice." He stopped before the window, gazing out at the falling snow. The city was muffled beneath it, every sound softened into stillness. "Perhaps," he murmured, "there is no justice in this world at all, only consequences." His tone carried such weight that I felt compelled to lighten it. "And yet, without your intervention, those consequences might have included my untimely demise. You must allow that your deductions have restored at least one small measure of balance." Holmes turned to me then, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "My dear Watson, you are an incorrigible optimist. It is your most admirable flaw. Very well, let us call it a Christmas miracle that my intellect spared your excellent constitution." We both laughed softly at that, and for the first time that day, the tension in the room eased. Missus Hudson entered just then with a tray of tea and mince pies, her eyes alight with the simple cheer that neither poison nor vengeance could extinguish. Holmes accepted a cup, studying the steam as though it carried another puzzle for him to solve. "Tell me," he said at last, "if you were to write this account, and I have no doubt you will, what title would you give it?" I hesitated. "Perhaps something fitting for the season, though it hardly seems a tale of goodwill. Still, the title that comes to mind is the one you yourself gave it, The Christmas Gift That Killed a Man." Holmes inclined his head. "Appropriate. The irony will not be lost on your readers, and perhaps, when they have finished, they will remember that truth is rarely found where appearances suggest it." He set down his cup and glanced again at the window. The snow had ceased. Faint carolers' voices floated from some distant square. Holmes's expression softened, though his voice retained that cool precision I had come to know so well. "Watson," he said quietly, "if ever the world sends you a gift too beautiful to be believed, open it cautiously." I chuckled, yet I knew he meant it earnestly. For in that single remark lay the essence of all he had uncovered, that even amid Christmas cheer, deceit may wear the guise of grace. As the clock chimed midnight, Holmes drew his violin from its case and began to play a slow, haunting melody that seemed to weave itself with the quiet snow beyond the pane. It was neither sad nor joyful, but something between, as though he played for all those souls lost to folly, vengeance, and pride. And I, listening there in the warm glow of Baker Street, could not help but think that perhaps Sherlock Holmes, in his own way, had given London its truest Christmas gift, a moment of clarity in a world shrouded by illusion. The following morning found London wrapped in a crystalline hush. The snowfall of the previous night had softened every corner of Baker Street, turning the gaslit lampposts into glittering sentinels of silence. I awoke to find Holmes already at work, the morning paper crumpled beside him, and the faint aroma of fresh coffee rising from the table. His face bore that look of languid contentment that came only after a case was resolved to his satisfaction, though his mind, I knew, was far from idle. "Good morning, Holmes," I said, stirring the fire. "You've been up for hours, I presume?" He smiled slightly. "Since 5:30. A restless brain, Watson, cannot sleep upon unsolved equations. Fortunately, this particular problem has, I believe, yielded its final term." He passed me the newspaper. The front page bore the headline, "Body recovered from the Thames, mystery of the Christmas murders ends." The report was brief but grim. A fisherman near Blackfriars Bridge had discovered the remains of Captain Ezra Penrith. Identified by personal effects and the silver pendant, he wore a small charm in the shape of a ship's wheel. The coroner had ruled it a deliberate drowning. "So it is finished," I murmured. "The man's vengeance dies with him." Holmes's fingers drummed lightly on the table. "In one sense, yes. But consider, Watson, the ingenuity of his design, the symbolism of his chosen instrument. Those things suggest a mind capable of rare brilliance, twisted though it became. The story of Captain Penrith is not merely one of revenge, but of obsession born from betrayal. It is a pattern I have observed often when intellect is stripped of conscience. It turns inward and devours itself." He rose, pacing to the window, his silhouette framed against the pale morning light. "Do you recall, my dear fellow, the inscription on the dove, 'Peace on earth'? How often mankind misuses those very words. Penrith sought to bring peace through destruction. A paradox, most human in its folly." I joined him at the window. Outside, a group of children were rolling a snowball in the street, their laughter echoing brightly in the cold air. "And yet," I said, "there is goodness still. The same city that breeds villains also shelters innocents." Holmes's gaze softened. "Quite so. Which is why I tolerate it, Watson. Humanity is an exasperating riddle, but even in its darkest corners, one may find small constellations of virtue. Without them, my work would be intolerable." He turned back to his desk, gathering his notes into a folder. "Lestrade came by earlier. He reports that the last of Penrith's accomplices, this sailor, Roker, has confessed his part and will face the courts. Scotland Yard, naturally, takes full credit for solving the affair." I smiled. "And you take no offense?" "None whatever. Recognition is the least valuable form of reward." "I have all I require here," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the violin resting beside the fire and almost imperceptibly toward me. I was moved more deeply than I cared to admit. "Still, it would please me to record the matter properly," I said. "Perhaps the public may learn that even the season of goodwill is not immune to human frailty." Holmes inclined his head. "Then write it, Watson, but write it as it truly was. No embellishment, no sensationalism. Let the tale serve not as entertainment, but as reflection. For though the weapon was unique, the motive was as old as Cain." He began to fill his pipe, his expression thoughtful. "It is curious," he went on, "how easily a man may drift into darkness. Fortescue and Vale robbed Penrith without remorse. He, in turn, murdered them believing himself just. Yet who among them first set the chain in motion? Where does guilt truly begin? The law will decide that, I said quietly. Ah, but the law, he replied, striking a match, is a blunt instrument. It punishes acts, not causes. That distinction, Watson, is what keeps men like me in perpetual employment. The smoke curled upward as he settled back in his chair. Outside, the sound of the children's laughter faded, replaced by the distant toll of street Paul's bells. For a time, neither of us spoke. The case had left an invisible residue like the faint scent of almonds that had once filled Fortescue's dining room, haunting in its persistence. At last, Holmes broke the silence. You see, my dear friend, peace is never found in gifts or gestures, but in understanding. Penrith believed he could deliver it by force. I, on the other hand, prefer to earn it through reason. He looked into the fire, his eyes reflecting its glow. Reason, when guided by conscience, is the only antidote to madness. Remember that, Watson, when next the world wraps evil in ribbon and calls it good. I smiled faintly, knowing that behind his detached tone lay genuine conviction. I shall remember, I said. Holmes leaned back, closing his eyes. Good. Then perhaps, after all, this grim affair has given us a Christmas lesson worth keeping. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the snow continued to fall upon the quiet city, burying its sins, at least for a time, beneath a mantle of pure white. And so ended the Christmas gift that killed a man, a case that reminded both detective and doctor that beneath the season's shining surface, truth lies fragile as glass, waiting only for the keenest of eyes to see it. The days that followed slipped quietly into the new year, and London resumed its ordinary rhythm, fog, clatter, and commerce, replacing the hush of Christmas. Yet, for Holmes and me, the affair of the Christmas gift that killed a man lingered in conversation long after the newspapers had ceased to print its details. There was something about the case, a strange mingling of melancholy and meaning that had impressed itself deeply upon us both. It was on the evening of January 2nd when I found Holmes once again by the hearth, his violin resting beside him, the cabinet containing the silver doves now locked and sealed for delivery to Scotland Yard. I had just returned from visiting a patient in Kensington and found the sitting room steeped in that familiar haze of tobacco and thought. Holmes was not reading nor writing. He sat motionless, his eyes half closed, as though listening to something far beyond the room. You are unusually still tonight, Holmes, I said, hanging up my coat. One would almost think your mind has at last found repose. Repose? He echoed softly. No, my dear Watson, merely reflection. The machinery of deduction may rest, but the human conscience seldom does. This case has left me considering the delicate boundary between intellect and empathy, between reason and mercy. I smiled. Strange words from a man who claims to be ruled by logic alone. He glanced toward me, a spark of amusement lighting his features. Even a machine, Watson, must sometimes observe the consequences of its output. Penrith's death was not a victory. It was an inevitable end to a problem no man could solve without tragedy. I took my seat opposite him. And yet, you solved it. Ah, but solving a crime and mending its cause are two different undertakings. I fear mankind is more inclined toward the first. He rose and walked to the window. The city, you see, forgets too quickly. By tomorrow, Fortescue's name will fade from the headlines, Vale's estate will be sold, and the river will swallow its secrets. But the lesson remains, though none may heed it. His tone held no bitterness, only quiet resignation. Do you know what most unsettled me, Watson? It was not Penrith's cruelty, but his sincerity. He believed utterly in the righteousness of his deeds. He thought himself an angel of judgment, wielding poison as others wield the pen. That is the most dangerous form of madness, the madness that wears conviction like armor. I considered his words. Perhaps that is what drives all men who cross the line. Whether in vengeance, politics, or faith, They convince themselves they are right. Holmes turned sharply, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. Precisely. It is self-deception, not hatred, that breeds the darkest evils. Fortescue deceived himself that his thefts were commerce. Penrith deceived himself that his murders were justice. Both, in their own ways, were victims of delusion. That, Watson, is what fascinates me most about humanity. It is capable of infinite logic, yet never free from the fog of moral blindness. He took up his violin then, tuned it with methodical precision. Music, he said absently, is the one pure form of expression left untouched by deceit. It cannot lie. Each note reveals the truth of its maker. As he began to play a low, somber melody that trembled like a prayer, the lamplight caught the faint frost on the window pane, and the sound seemed to mingle with the slow hiss of the fire. It was not a triumphant tune, but one of mourning and contemplation, a requiem for those who had perished in pursuit of peace. When he finished, the silence that followed was deep and strangely comforting. I rose, poured him a glass of brandy, and handed it to him. He accepted it with a faint nod. "Do you ever tire of it, Holmes?" I asked after a moment. "Of peering into the darkness of men's souls?" He smiled faintly, his gaze distant. "At times. But if we do not study the darkness, Watson, how else shall we recognize the light? Each crime, each deception, each tragedy, these are lessons. And if I can learn even one truth from them that may prevent another, then perhaps the work has meaning." I looked around the familiar room at the cluttered desk, the violin's curve glinting in the firelight, the quiet pulse of life that seemed to emanate from Holmes himself. "Then what truth have you learned from this one?" He sipped the brandy thoughtfully. "That gifts, like motives, must be unwrapped with caution, and that even in the season of peace, one must never mistake appearance for reality." Outside, a carriage rattled past, its wheels hissing through the melting snow. Holmes placed the glass aside and rose, stretching as though casting off the weight of the past weeks. "Now then," he said briskly, his familiar energy returning, "I believe you mentioned earlier that you have been invited to dine with your patient's family. Go, Watson, enjoy the society of the sane. I, meanwhile, intend to spend the evening reacquainting myself with Buck." I hesitated at the door, looking back once more at the man whose mind had pierced through yet another web of deceit. "Holmes," I said quietly, "whatever else the world forgets, I shall not forget this case, nor the life you saved." He inclined his head, a rare gentleness in his eyes. "Then we are both the richer for it, my dear friend." And as I stepped into the snowy street, I heard behind me the first clear notes of his violin rising once more, swift, measured, and utterly precise, a sound of pure reason cutting through the cold London night. The following morning dawned crisp and bright, the sun scattering diamonds across the melting snow of Baker Street. London had returned, almost cruelly, to its ordinary rhythms, carriages rattling, vendors shouting, and the occasional wail of a distant steam whistle. But within 221B, the atmosphere was tempered, reflective, a quiet interlude after the storm of the past fortnight. Holmes sat near the fire, pipe between his fingers, examining the past, final reports sent by Lestrade. The case of the Christmas gift that killed a man was formally closed. Penrith's body had been recovered from the Thames, Roker had confessed, and the intercepted parcel had prevented further tragedy. Yet, as always, Holmes's satisfaction was tempered with the faintest trace of solemnity. "Watson," he said at last, breaking the silence, "one might imagine that the conclusion of a case brings relief and even triumph. In truth, I find it more instructive to reflect upon the chain of human folly that leads to such disasters." Captain Penrith believed he was delivering justice. Yet justice requires reason tempered by morality, not imagination fueled by grievance. I nodded, still unsettled by the intricacies of the affair. "And the silver doves, Holmes, will they remain here?" He waved toward the cabinet where they rested. They shall be delivered to Scotland Yard for safekeeping, along with a full report on their mechanisms. As objects, they are marvels of ingenuity. As instruments, they are deadly. In the hands of a man untrained, they would be a mere curiosity. In the hands of one obsessed, they became murder incarnate. Holmes rose, walking to the window. He gazed out at the city with that familiar intensity, the firelight painting angular shadows across his face. Consider, Watson, the sequence of events was predictable once one understood Penrith's mind. His obsession followed a precise logic. First Fortescue, then Vale, then the intended final target. You, by the way, the unwitting pivot of his narrative. Each step was deliberate, yet each revealed the narrowness of his vision. His genius was constrained by vengeance. I felt the chill of forethought at his words. And yet, for all his intelligence, he failed. You foresaw his plan and intercepted it. Holmes' lips quirked slightly. Foresight is the tool of reason. Observation alone is insufficient. One must anticipate not merely the action, but the motive that drives it. Penrith's error was moral rather than intellectual. He misjudged the human compass, believing that the world operated solely on principle, not on law, chance, or intervention. He returned to his chair, drawing his pipe to his lips. In cases such as this, Watson, we are reminded that every detail matters. The faint trace of volcanic ash, the bamboo fiber impressions, the ink and paper, they formed a lattice that led us inexorably to the culprit. Without attention to minutiae, the pattern dissolves. The smallest observation, when properly interpreted, becomes the key to understanding the whole. I leaned back in my chair, pondering. It is extraordinary, Holmes, how you reconstruct the mind of another so completely. Holmes regarded me with a rare warmth. Extraordinary. Yes, but not miraculous. It is the product of careful observation, disciplined reasoning, and a mind unclouded by sentiment. And of course, an intimate familiarity with human weakness. The room fell into quiet reflection, interrupted only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. I could not help but feel a measure of awe at the events that had unfolded. Death, disguised as gift. Vengeance wrapped in irony. And yet, thanks to Holmes's insight, the cycle had been broken. After a moment, Holmes rose and collected his violin. "Come, Watson," he said. "Let us close the matter formally. Music, like reason, has a rhythm and pattern. It is far more forgiving than human judgment, yet it conveys truth with elegance." He began to play, a slow, deliberate melody that seemed to carry the weight of all we had witnessed. I listened in silence, reflecting upon the lessons of the case. That appearances deceive, that intellect untempered by morality can become dangerous, and that even in the darkest hours, clarity and reason can prevail. When the last notes faded, Holmes set the violin aside and turned to me. "The affair is concluded, Watson. Let the snow of London cover it now, leaving only memory and record. And as ever, let us remain vigilant, for human folly is unending, and those who would cloak their vengeance in beauty are never entirely absent." I nodded, understanding the finality and the caution in his words. The city outside gleamed in winter's quiet light, and within Baker Street, a sense of peace had settled, fragile, yet profound. Holmes finally lit his pipe and reclined, the firelight flickering across his composed features. "Now," he said lightly, "let us think of other matters. Matters less mortal, more musical. Christmas, after all, is past, and London awaits the adventures of the new year." I smiled, realizing that even amid snow, shadows, and murder, life would continue, guided by the steady hand and keen mind of Sherlock Holmes. And so ended the Christmas gift that killed a man. A tale of ingenuity, vengeance, and observation, leaving behind a lesson as piercing as the London frost, that truth, however obscured, is always discoverable to those who seek it with reason and care.